Open the damn door immediately. My husband kicked down the door, suspecting that I was being unfaithful, but as soon as he stepped inside, he turned pale at the sight of. The house had a sepulchral atmosphere. Despite its imposing structure, with tall windows overlooking a perfectly trimmed garden, a dense, oppressive silence filled the space. The hallways were immaculate, each piece of furniture meticulously placed as if no one actually used them. Within this fortress of order and discipline, Juliana had grown up with a constant feeling of suffocation, as if her father's scrutinizing gaze followed her every step, every thought, every attempt to be free. The wall clock struck 6 in the morning with a firm, metallic chime. The young woman opened her eyes at the first sound, long accustomed to waking up without an alarm. Her body had been trained since childhood to respond to the routine imposed by her father. She got up immediately, leaving her bed perfectly made, with every fold of the sheets smoothed out. It wasn't a spoken requirement, but any lapse had silent consequences, icy stares, cutting remarks that pierced deeper than any physical punishment. She walked to the bathroom with calculated movements, avoiding any unnecessary noise. As cold water ran down her face, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. She knew this day would be particularly difficult. It was her last day of school before starting university, and although her father had allowed her to study in the city, she understood that her independence would never be real. "Juliana, come down." Her father's authoritative voice echoed from the dining room. There were no screams in their home. They weren't necessary. The coldness in his tone was enough to let her know she had to obey immediately. She descended the stairs with a straight back, as if an invisible weight forced her to maintain perfect posture. Upon entering the dining room, her father, Hernan, was seated in his usual spot, the newspaper spread open in front of him, a steaming cup of coffee to his right. Her mother, Laura, served breakfast with mechanical movements, avoiding eye contact with her husband at all costs. "Sit down," he ordered without looking up. Juliana obeyed and served herself a minimal portion of fruit. She knew her father noticed everything, even how much she ate. Starting the day with something light was the safest option. "Today is your last day of school," Hernan said, folding his newspaper with meticulous calm. "Starting tomorrow, your time will be used more efficiently." She nodded without daring to reply. Any display of emotion or enthusiasm was frowned upon in this house. "I spoke with the university's dean," he continued. "He assured me that their engineering program is one of the best. I expect you to make the most of it." Juliana's stomach tightened. Engineering. It had never been her choice, but she had never had the right to choose. She wanted to study literature, to explore worlds through words, but that had never been an option. "Thank you, Dad." The man nodded in approval. Laura, still silent, simply poured more coffee into her husband's cup. Her hands trembled slightly, a detail that did not go unnoticed by Juliana. Breakfast continued with the same monotonous rhythm as always. When it was over, Juliana got up to leave for school. Hernan stopped her with a subtle motion of his hand. "Remember what I've taught you," he murmured with an impassive expression. "I don't want any unnecessary distractions. In university, you'll be on your own, but that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want." She swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, Dad." As she stepped outside, the fresh air wrapped around her, bringing a fleeting sense of relief. She walked down the street in her immaculate uniform, her backpack light, but her mind weighed down by thoughts she could never express. When she arrived at school, the noise of the students greeted her with an energy foreign to her world. Her classmates talked about their plans for university, about traveling, about the excitement of independence. "Juliana, have you packed yet for your move to the city?" asked Camila, one of her classmates. She forced a smile. "Not yet. It's going to be amazing." "Total freedom," another girl laughed. "No parents controlling every second of our lives." Juliana didn't respond. Not everyone really escaped. The last class passed without her being able to fully concentrate. Her mind drifted between fear and hope, between the desire to be free and the certainty that her father would never truly let her be. After school, she headed straight home. She knew any delay would be questioned. When she arrived, the house was silent as always. She went up to her room and locked the door. It was one of the few acts of rebellion she allowed herself. She sat on the bed and pulled an old notebook from its hiding place beneath the mattress. It was her diary, the only place where she could truly be herself. "I'm leaving, but I know he will still control everything. He won't let me go. Will I ever be free?" She wrote those words with a mix of desperation and resignation. The door to her room suddenly burst open. "I don't want you to do that again," Hernan said coldly. "There's nothing in this house that needs to be locked." A chill ran down Juliana's spine. Her father didn't yell, didn't issue direct threats, but his mere presence was enough to make her feel trapped. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't do it again." He shut the door behind him without another word. Juliana remained seated on the bed, the notebook still in her hands. She knew her father would never change. She knew that no matter how far she went, he would always find a way to control her life. Juliana sat frozen for several minutes. Her body refused to move, as if her mind had detached itself from reality. The notebook was still in her hands, the ink on the page still fresh. She knew her father would never change, but what terrified her most was the certainty that his shadow would follow her even when she was no longer in that house. She had spent her whole life under an invisible presence that suffocated her breath, shaped her thoughts, and filtered her words before they could leave her lips. The echo of her father's footsteps faded down the hallway. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe normally. She closed the diary and slid it back under the mattress. That small collection of forbidden thoughts was the only refuge she had in this world. Outside, the night had settled in, heavy and oppressive. Juliana lay down, but she couldn't sleep right away. Fear seeped into every crack of her consciousness. The fear that her father might open the door at any moment without warning. The fear that, even at university, he would continue watching her every move from afar. When exhaustion finally overtook her, her dreams were a mix of memories and shadows. Her father staring at her with a blank expression, her mother with her head bowed as she poured coffee, the feeling of being trapped in a cage she could never escape. The next morning, the house was the same as always. Her mother prepared breakfast in silence while her father read the newspaper with his usual unshakable discipline. The only difference was the suitcase by the door. "Today, you'll move into the university dorm," her father murmured without looking up from the paper. "Don't forget, this opportunity is not a right. It's a privilege. Don't disappoint me." Juliana nodded. She said nothing more. In this house, words were dangerous if used too freely. She got into the car and stared out the window as the city began to unfold before her eyes. Tall buildings, people walking hurriedly, the sound of traffic filling the air. It was a world completely different from the controlled and suffocating home she had grown up in. When they arrived at the dorm, her father didn't bother walking her to the door. "I'll come by tomorrow to make sure everything is in order," he said before leaving. Juliana watched him walk away and felt an invisible pressure in her chest ease slightly. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was a step closer to it. The room she had been assigned was small but cozy. A desk by the window, a single bed with white sheets, a lamp that barely gave enough light. It was hers. For the first time in her life, a space belonged to her alone. She spent the first few hours unpacking, trying to convince herself that this new beginning truly meant something. In the afternoon, she decided to explore the area. The university was full of students, each with their own story, their own path. She wondered if anyone else felt the same fear she did. She wandered aimlessly until the scent of coffee drew her toward a small corner cafe. The place had a warm atmosphere with dim lighting and worn wooden tables. She ordered a coffee and sat by the window. Watching people pass by felt like looking at a world she wasn't yet a part of. "Mind if I sit here?" The male voice pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up and saw a man in his mid-30s. Tall, with a kind expression, but with a firm presence that was impossible to ignore. "Go ahead," she replied, not entirely sure why she allowed it. The man sat down across from her and placed his coffee on the table. "I'm Paolo. Juliana." He smiled, and there was something familiar in his eyes. She didn't know what it was, but it didn't make her uncomfortable. "Are you new in town?" She nodded. "I came to study at the university." "Interesting. What are you studying?" "Engineering." Paolo took a sip of his coffee before responding. "You don't sound convinced." Juliana lowered her gaze. "It wasn't my choice." A brief silence followed, but instead of asking unnecessary questions, Paolo simply observed her. "Sometimes what we don't choose leads us to unexpected places." She didn't know how to respond. She had spent her life following a path she hadn't chosen, and the idea that it could lead her to something good was difficult to process. Paolo changed the subject naturally, asking about the city, her first impressions. The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised her. She wasn't used to talking to strangers, but with him, she didn't feel the need to measure every word. When night fell, Paolo stood up and left a bill on the table. "Next time, the coffee's on you." Juliana watched him walk out of the cafe, feeling a strange sense of anticipation in her chest. She didn't yet know what that encounter meant, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. Juliana left the cafe, her mind tangled in thoughts that hadn't fully taken shape. She walked back to her dorm feeling that something had changed, even though she couldn't quite define what. Paolo had appeared in her life unexpectedly, and though they had exchanged only a few words, there was something about him that made her feel seen in a different way. Not like her father, who measured everything by performance. Not with the indifference of her mother, who always avoided confrontation. With Paolo, for the first time in a long while, she had felt like she existed beyond the limits imposed by others. The room was dark when she entered. She collapsed onto the bed and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come right away. Her father was coming to the university the next day to make sure everything was in order. It didn't matter that she was officially living on her own. His shadow still loomed over every step she took. She wondered what he would say if he knew she had been talking to a man nearly twice her age. He would probably find it unacceptable, a dangerous deviation from the straight path he had laid out for her. And maybe he was right. Or maybe that was exactly what made it so tempting. The next morning, her father's visit was exactly what she expected. He scanned her room with his usual critical eye, inspected her belongings as if searching for evidence of some imaginary crime, and asked sharp questions about her schedule, her professors, and the classmates she interacted with. Juliana answered in monosyllables, avoiding any comment that could be interpreted as defiance. When he finally finished his inspection, he stood by the door and looked at her with that expression that always made her blood run cold. "Don't waste your time on nonsense," he said in a tone that allowed no argument. "University isn't a game. Don't waste your time with people who aren't worth it." Juliana held his gaze, feeling the familiar weight in her chest. "I know." He nodded slowly, as if evaluating the sincerity of her words. "We'll see each other soon." He walked out without waiting for a response. Juliana remained silent until the sound of his footsteps disappeared down the hallway. Only then did she let out a restrained sigh. That evening, when Paolo sent her a message inviting her for another coffee, she accepted without hesitation. The second meeting was more relaxed than the first. Paolo was waiting at the same table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, and an expression of calm that she envied. Juliana sat across from him without worrying about measuring her words. She allowed herself to smile a little more, to talk a little more. She told him about her childhood under her father's rigid control, though without going into too much detail. Paolo listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply said, "You deserve more." The phrase hit her with unexpected force. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had dared to question the structure in which she had been molded. Coffee turned into dinners, into late-night calls, into long walks where Juliana learned to speak without fear. With him, she could be more than the perfect daughter, the model student, the young woman who obeyed without question. Paolo treated her with a deference that made her feel special, as if she were someone worth knowing. Not a child who needed to be guided, but a woman who had something to say. For months later, Paolo proposed. It was in a small restaurant, far from the crowded spots in the city. There were no kneeling on one knee, no rehearsed speeches. Just him, holding her hand firmly, telling her he wanted her in his life forever. Juliana felt like the world stopped for a moment. She knew it was fast, that people would say she was making a mistake. But when she imagined her life without him, all she saw was the emptiness she had always felt before meeting him. "Yes," she whispered. Paolo smiled and kissed her hand tenderly. He didn't have a ring, but that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that she had made a choice of her own. When she told her parents, their reaction was not what she had hoped for. Her mother, as always, said nothing. She just remained silent, staring at the table as if Juliana's words were nothing more than background noise. Her father, on the other hand, stood up abruptly, his face a mask of disbelief and disdain. "Are you telling me you're going to marry a man you barely know?" Juliana kept her back straight, trying not to show the trembling in her hands. "I know him well enough." Hernan let out a dry laugh, one devoid of any humor. "You're just a child. You know nothing about life. And now you want to hand it over to a stranger." "He's not a stranger. To me, he is. And to you too." Laura shifted uncomfortably in her chair, as if she wanted to disappear from the conversation. "Dad, this is my decision." Hernan looked at her with a coldness that made fear settle in her stomach like a knot of steel. "If you marry him, don't expect my support." The silence became heavy, almost suffocating. Juliana held his gaze, feeling that for the first time in her life, she was standing at the edge of a precipice from which there was no turning back. "I'm not asking you for anything." The anger in her father's eyes was confirmation that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She married Paolo without her family's blessing. Her mother did not attend the wedding, though she later sent a brief message saying she hoped she would be happy. Her father never called her again. The wedding day was simple, without excessive decorations or extravagance. Just the two of them, looking into each other's eyes and promising to stay together. To Juliana, it felt like freedom. For the first time, she had chosen her own destiny. But what she didn't know was that, at that moment, she wasn't escaping a prison. She was just changing cells. The first month of marriage, Juliana believed she had found the peace she had longed for. The house she shared with Paolo was neither large nor luxurious, but it had a warmth far from the rigidity in which she had grown up. She woke up with the feeling that she had finally taken control of her life. Sometimes, she caught herself humming in the kitchen while making coffee, something she never would have done in her father's house. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe without feeling like she was walking on glass. Paolo was attentive. He came home from work with small gifts, a box of chocolates, a novel he thought she might like. At night, he held her until he fell asleep, whispering that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Juliana allowed herself to believe it was true. She had bet everything on this marriage, cut ties with her family, put her career on hold. It had to be worth it. But soon, she started noticing small things. Things that, at first, seemed insignificant. Paolo had a habit of checking his phone when she wasn't around. Always with an excuse, he had left it on the table. He thought he had received an important message. He also made comments about her clothes. Nothing aggressive, nothing that could be interpreted as an order, but with just enough tone for her to understand the suggestion. "That skirt is a little short, don't you think?" he murmured one night while they were having dinner. Juliana looked down at her outfit, confused. "You think so?" Paolo smiled, stroking her hand on the table. "It's not that it doesn't look good on you, of course it does. It's just that. I don't want other men looking at you like that." It wasn't a prohibition. He hadn't yelled at her, hadn't insulted her. And yet, the words lingered in her mind for days. The next time she got dressed, without realizing it, she chose a longer skirt. Paolo's opinions started shaping her daily life without her noticing. First, it was her clothes, then it was her outings. If she ever mentioned wanting to see her old friends, he would kiss her forehead and tell her how much he would miss her. "I don't like being alone without you," he whispered. "Do you really have to go?" The first time she canceled a meeting with Marina, her best friend from college, she didn't think much of it. The second time, she justified it by thinking that Paolo was right, that her home should be her priority. The third time, Marina stopped insisting. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Juliana dropped out of college, saying she wanted to focus on her new married life. Paolo celebrated the decision as if he had won a prize. "You're an incredible woman," he told her. "Not everyone understands the importance of family." She smiled, but a slight discomfort settled in her chest. Paolo's control didn't come all at once. It crept into her life like an invisible fog, covering every corner before she even realized when it had started. She stopped wearing certain clothes without noticing, stopped going out without him ever explicitly telling her not to. Paolo took care of the shopping, managed the money, organized every aspect of the household. At first, it seemed considerate. Later, it became another form of dependency. One night, while washing the dishes, she heard the door close harder than usual. Paolo walked into the kitchen with tight lips and a furrowed brow. "Where were you today?" Juliana blinked, confused. "Here at home." "Don't lie to me." A chill ran down her spine. Paolo had never spoken to her in that tone before. "I'm not lying. I didn't go out." Paolo stared at her for a few seconds. Then he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I'm sorry. It's just, I'm tired. I had a rough day at work." Juliana felt the fear that had crawled up her body begin to fade. She forced herself to smile. "I'll make you some tea." That night, as they settled into bed, Paolo held her tightly. "Sometimes the thought of losing you terrifies me," he whispered. Juliana felt a lump in her throat. Something about his tone didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a warning. In the following weeks, Paolo started calling her more often when she was out. At first, they were casual messages. "How are you, love?" Then, they turned into questions. "Where are you?" And later, into demands. "Answer me." Juliana convinced herself that it was normal, that it was because he loved her, that it was his way of caring. But something inside her was slowly beginning to fade. One night, when Paolo came home from work, he found Juliana looking at her phone. She set it down on the table and walked over to greet him with a kiss on the cheek. But he didn't respond. He just stared at her, his eyes fixed on the phone. "Who were you talking to?" "Marina." She asked if I wanted to see her tomorrow. Paolo smiled, but something in his expression unsettled her. "And are you going?" "I thought I would." He didn't say anything. He calmly took off his jacket and walked into the living room. "I didn't know you two still talked." "Sometimes." Paolo nodded slowly. Then he looked at her, as if carefully choosing his words. "I thought we were past that stage." Juliana frowned. "What stage?" "The one where we spend time with people who don't understand our life." A chill ran down her spine. "Marina is my friend." "Of course," Paolo said with a smile. "Do whatever you want. Just remember, not everyone wants the best for us." Juliana didn't respond. The next morning, when she checked her phone, she saw that Marina had left several messages. But before she could reply, Paolo walked over and took her phone. "I made you breakfast," he said with a smile. "Don't check your phone now. Today is our day." Juliana set her phone down on the table. She felt something twist inside her, but she said nothing. She just sat down to have breakfast with her husband. Without realizing it, that was the beginning of the isolation. Over time, she stopped replying to messages. Then she stopped receiving them. Marina became a distant memory. Paolo had done it without raising his voice, without a single threat. He didn't need to forbid her. He only needed Juliana to believe he was doing it out of love. Control became the norm. The house they lived in stopped feeling like a refuge and started feeling like an invisible cage. Juliana tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that Paolo loved her, that everything he did was for her well-being. But every time she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw a woman she didn't recognize. She was no longer the young woman who had escaped her father's oppression. She was someone else. Someone who, without realizing it, was living the same story in a different setting. The difference was that this time, She had nowhere to run. Juliana no longer checked the clock. Time didn't belong to her anymore. Every minute spent outside the house was a silent countdown before Paolo started calling. At first, the messages came casually. Then, more frequently. When she didn't respond right away, the calls started. And if she didn't answer, Paolo's voice in the recordings became sharper, more demanding. Where are you? Why are you taking so long to answer? I hope you're not doing something you shouldn't be. She had learned to live with those questions hanging in the air. She had learned to measure her words before speaking, to walk lightly, to adjust the tone of her voice to avoid an unnecessary reaction. Paolo's control had become a reflex in her daily life. She went out less, spoke to no one outside of those he approved of, avoided making plans that required being away for too long. But everything changed with an unexpected call. She was in the kitchen when the phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but she recognized her mother's voice immediately. Your father is in the hospital. Juliana's heart stopped for a second. What happened? A heart attack. He's stable, but the doctors say his condition is serious. Juliana felt the air grow heavy. She pressed the phone against her ear. I'm on my way. She hung up without thinking. When she turned around, Paolo was standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Where are you going? My father is in the hospital. He had a heart attack. He didn't react right away. He just looked at her with that calculated calm she now knew so well. And what are you going to do there? What do you mean, what am I going to do? He's my father. Paolo tilted his head slightly. Your father wasn't at our wedding. He hasn't tried to contact you in months. And now, just because he's sick, you run to his side? Juliana felt a tightness in her chest. I'm not going to argue with you about this. I'm leaving. She tried to walk past him, but Paolo reached out and grabbed her arm. Not forcefully, but just enough to stop her. If you leave, make no mistake, you're choosing him over me. Juliana felt her skin burn where he touched her. Don't do this. You're my wife. And he's my father. Paolo clenched his jaw. I don't want you to go. Juliana yanked her arm free and walked toward the door. I've made my decision. When she arrived at the hospital, the sight of her father in the bed hit her harder than she expected. Hernan, the man who had always seemed indestructible, was hooked up to monitors, his face pale, his gaze heavy. Her mother sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap, not looking up. When he saw her, his lips curled into a barely visible smile. I knew you'd come. Juliana stepped closer. How are you feeling? Like an old man who's made too many mistakes. Her father's voice still had the same authoritative tone as always, but his body betrayed his frailty. Juliana sat in the chair beside the bed. Don't say that. He slowly turned his head and studied her with an analytical gaze. You have the same look as your mother. Juliana frowned. What do you mean? That look of someone who's learned to stay silent. The comment hit her in an unexpected way. I'm fine. Are you? I didn't come here to talk about me. Hernan took a deep breath, as if it was difficult to fill his lungs. What's your husband like? Juliana felt a lump in her throat. He's fine. That's not an answer. She swallowed hard. He's a good man. Really? Juliana looked away. Why do you always have to question everything? Because I know you. And because I know when someone is trapped. Juliana's breathing became erratic. I'm not trapped. That's exactly what your mother used to say. Her father's words hit her harder than she expected. Hernan closed his eyes for a few seconds. Listen to me, Juliana. If that man controls you the way I controlled your mother, get out before it's too late. Juliana felt like she couldn't breathe. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. She stood up abruptly. Get some rest. I'll come see you tomorrow. But she never did. She came home late, feeling anxiety crawl over her skin. She knew what awaited her beyond that door. Paolo was sitting on the couch, the TV on at a low volume. He didn't look at her when she walked in. Did you have fun? The tone of his voice put her on alert. This isn't the time for that. Of course it is. You had hours to be with your father. Why can't we talk now? Juliana closed her eyes for a moment. I don't want to argue. Well, I do. He stood up from the couch and walked toward her with slow, calculated steps. Do you know how long I waited for you? Paolo, do you know how many times I called you? Juliana felt her skin burn. I turned off my phone. Of course, you did. Before she could react, Paolo grabbed her arm and pushed her against the wall. It wasn't a hard blow. He didn't knock her down. He didn't leave bruises. But something inside her broke. She looked at him, breathless, speechless. Paolo seemed frozen too. He ran a hand over his face and then suddenly let go of her. I didn't mean to do that. Juliana felt tears burn in her eyes. Paolo. He took a step back, his expression tormented. God. I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. She didn't move. You made me do this, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Juliana felt the air grow heavy in her lungs. You made me worry. You made me think things that weren't true. She swallowed hard, unable to respond. Paolo took another step back. This won't happen again. Juliana wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to the idea that it had just been a bad moment. But as he walked away, she knew the truth. Paolo's control had never been love. And this was only the beginning. Juliana woke up with her body tense, the memory of the previous night lodged deep in her mind. Paolo slept beside her, his breathing slow and steady, as if nothing had happened. She stared at him for a few seconds, trying to find any trace of guilt on his face, any genuine remorse. But all she saw was calm, as if what he had done meant nothing. She got up carefully, making no noise. She walked to the bathroom and shut the door softly, afraid that any unnecessary sound would wake him. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her face had no bruises, her skin was unmarked. But something inside her felt shattered. She touched her arm where Paolo had grabbed her, remembering the pressure of his fingers, the way he had shoved her against the wall. She ran her hands over her face, trying to shake off the feeling that her body no longer belonged to her. She told herself it had just been a moment of tension, that Paolo wasn't like that it was her fault for making him angry. When she stepped out of the bathroom, he was already awake. He sat on the bed, his face buried in his hands. When he saw her, he got up and approached her with a defeated expression. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have done that. Juliana felt his words cut through her, but not in the way he intended. I don't know what happened to me, Paolo continued. I would never hurt you, you know that. She nodded silently. It's just that. I was so worried. I don't want to lose you, Juliana. I don't want anything or anyone to come between us. Something inside her tightened. It won't happen again, Paolo promised, taking her hands. I love you. Juliana forced herself to believe him. The following weeks were a mix of tense calm and uncomfortable silences. Paolo treated her with sweetness, with a calculated patience that made it feel like everything had been just a bad dream. He bought her flowers, showered her with attention, constantly reminded her of how important she was to him. But something in his gaze had changed. It wasn't just love she saw in his eyes anymore. There was something else. Something dark. The control Paolo had over her became more evident. Before, he would ask her not to see certain people. Now, he outright forbade her from going out without his permission. Before, he would casually glance at her phone. Now, he demanded it in his hands and inspected it with the meticulousness of someone searching for evidence of a crime. Juliana tried to resist, but every time she did, he found a way to make her feel guilty. You don't understand that I do this for you, he said, frustrated. The world is full of people trying to tear us apart. When Juliana tried to argue, when she mentioned that she needed to see someone, that she wanted to go out alone, Paolo snapped. He didn't touch her. He didn't hit her. But he threw the remote control against the wall with such force that the plastic shattered into pieces. Juliana froze. Paolo ran his hands through his hair, breathing heavily. Look at what you make me do. A lump formed in her throat. It didn't take long for Paolo to pick up the broken pieces from the floor and approach her again with his remorseful gaze. I didn't want to do that. It's just that. I can't stand the thought of anything happening to you. She nodded, her body still trembling. The outbursts of anger started becoming more frequent. The violence never reached her directly, but it struck everything around her. If Juliana said something he didn't like, Paolo would slam his fist on the table. If she asked for something he didn't want to do, he would throw his phone to the floor. If she dared to insist on going out, he would knock over chairs, slam doors, break anything within reach. She stopped speaking, stopped asking, stopped trying. The house no longer felt like a home. It had turned into a minefield. She never knew when a word, a gesture, or an action would trigger the next explosion. But the worst part wasn't when Paolo started yelling. The worst part was when he stopped. When she began to realize that his silence weighed more than any scream ever could. Paolo could go hours without saying a word, just staring at her with that stern expression, as if waiting for her to understand something without him having to say it. The message was clear. She knew what she had to do. She knew how she was supposed to behave. One day, while she was in the kitchen, her phone vibrated on the table. She turned quickly, heart pounding in her throat, afraid that Paolo would hear. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Juliana. It's Andres. We studied together at university. I hope you're doing well. Andres." She remembered his face, his kind voice, his slow, unhurried way of speaking. He had been one of the few classmates she had truly connected with. He had tried to keep in touch when she left university, but over time, the messages had faded away. Juliana stared at the screen, hesitant. Paolo was in the living room, watching TV. If he saw her replying, he would ask questions. She quickly put the phone away, but her mind remained stuck on the message. The next day, after Paolo left for work, Juliana picked up her phone with trembling hands. Andres had sent another message. "I'd like to see you. I'm worried about you." Juliana felt a knot in her chest. She didn't know what to do. If she agreed to see him, it meant defying Paolo. But part of her wanted to. She wanted to feel like she wasn't completely alone. After several minutes of hesitation, she quickly typed a response. "We can talk, but I can't stay long." The meeting was at a nearby park, far from any place where she could be seen. When she arrived, Andres was already waiting on a bench. The moment he saw her, his expression changed. "Juliana." She smiled nervously. "Hi, Andres." He looked at her in silence for a few seconds. "Are you okay?" Juliana felt her throat tighten. "Yes, of course. You don't look okay." She laughed nervously. "I'm just tired." Andres didn't seem convinced. "What happened with college?" "I tried calling you, but you disappeared." Juliana felt a pang of guilt. "I got married." Andres frowned. "To that man you told me about?" She nodded. "Juliana, are you sure you're okay? Please, don't ask me questions." He exhaled in frustration. "Can't you just tell me the truth?" She lowered her gaze. "It's not that easy." Andres sighed. "If you ever need anything at all, please tell me." Juliana nodded, feeling the weight of the words stuck in her throat. That night, when she got home, Paolo was waiting for her. "Where were you?" The tone of his voice made her shiver. "I went out for a walk." Paolo wasn't looking at her. He was just playing with his glass of whiskey in his hand. "Alone?" Juliana swallowed hard. "Yes." The glass in his hand trembled slightly. "Don't lie to me." Juliana felt her body freeze. "I'm not lying." Paolo stood up from the couch and walked toward her, his steps slow. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She quickly shook her head. "No." Paolo took a deep breath and suddenly, in a sharp motion, threw the glass against the wall. Juliana flinched as she felt the glass shatter beside her. Paolo looked at her, his breathing heavy. "Don't do this to me, Juliana." She felt the tears burn in her eyes. "I didn't do anything wrong." Paolo stared at her, his eyes filled with something that was no longer love. "From now on, you don't leave without my permission." She didn't answer. Because deep down, she knew she had no choice. The air inside the house had become unbearable. Juliana felt trapped within her own walls, as if every corner was slowly suffocating her. Paolo had turned her into a shadow, a distorted reflection of the person she had once dreamed of being. She had stopped going out, stopped answering messages, stopped fighting. But the worst part was that she had stopped feeling alive. Every morning, she woke up with the same emptiness in her chest, the same feeling that her life no longer belonged to her. Paolo controlled every aspect of her life, from what clothes she could wear to what programs they could watch on TV. He had stopped asking for her opinion months ago. She was nothing more than an extension of his will. But what tormented her the most was the certainty that she had allowed it all to happen. That night, while cleaning out her bedroom closet, she found a forgotten box among the things she had brought from her parents' house. With trembling hands, she opened it and found an old notebook with worn-out covers inside. She recognized it instantly. It was her childhood diary. She sat on the floor and began flipping through it. The messy handwriting of her younger self filled the pages with wishes that now seemed like impossible fantasies. When I grow up, I want to travel alone and discover the world. I want to read every book in existence and write one someday. I don't want anyone telling me what to do. Juliana felt a lump in her throat. That diary was proof that she had once been a girl with dreams, with illusions, with the hope of a different life. But now she was here, trapped in a prison she had built with her own choices. Paolo came home late that night, and Juliana knew at the moment she heard the door slam open. His footsteps were erratic, heavy. The smell of alcohol filled the house before he even spoke. "Where are you?" Juliana felt a chill run down her spine. She remained still, sitting on the bed, the diary still clutched in her hands. "Here." Paolo appeared in the doorway. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. His bloodshot eyes locked onto her with a mix of anger and something darker, something that made her shrink instinctively. "You didn't answer my messages." "I was busy." Paolo let out a bitter laugh. "Busy with what? Writing in your little girl diary?" Juliana pressed the notebook against her chest. "Leave me alone, Paolo." He took slow steps toward her. "Leave you alone? After everything I do for you?" She felt anger rising in her chest. "After everything you do for me? Do you really think this is love?" Paolo was silent for a moment, but then something in his expression changed. His eyes darkened, his breathing grew more erratic. "Then what is it? Who have you been talking to about us?" Juliana felt her stomach tighten. "No one." Paolo stepped closer. "Or is it that idiot Andres?" Juliana's heart stopped for an instant. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do." Before she could respond, someone knocked on the door. Paolo froze, his eyes locked onto her. "Are you expecting someone?" Juliana shook her head. Paolo walked heavily toward the door. When he opened it, Andres was standing there, his expression tense. "Is Juliana okay?" Paolo leaned against the doorframe with a mocking smile. "And who do you think you are, coming to my house asking about my wife? Let her speak." Paolo laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. "How sweet. Are you going to save her? Are you her hero?" Juliana felt fear take hold of her body. She walked to the door, trying to place herself between the two. "Andres, leave." Andres looked at her with concern. "Just tell me if you're okay." "Yes, I am." "Go." Paolo clicked his tongue. "Look at that, poor thing. You care so much about her, but she already has someone to take care of her." Andres didn't move. "If you ever need help." "I said get out." Paolo shoved Andres out of the doorway. Andres stumbled back but remained firm. "I'll see you soon, Juliana." Paolo slammed the door shut and slowly turned to her. "So, you're still in contact with him?" Juliana shook her head quickly. "I don't know why he came." Paolo ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. "I don't like you talking to him." "I'm not talking to him." "Don't lie to me." Paolo slammed his fist on the table. Juliana took a step back. "You need to calm down." "Calm down?" "Calm down." Paolo threw a chair to the floor in a violent motion. Juliana felt her body freeze. "You're ungrateful." "Paolo, everything you have is because of me. Stop. You're worthless." Juliana felt the world crumble around her. "Paolo, please." But before she could finish her sentence, she felt the blow. Her head snapped to the side from the impact. A burning sensation spread across her cheek. She remained still, her breathing shaky. The silence in the house was deafening. Paolo looked at her, his hands still in the air, as if he himself couldn't believe what he had just done. Juliana felt tears well up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Paolo slowly lowered his hand. Juliana. She didn't respond. He took a step toward her, but Juliana backed away. No. Paolo stood still. Don't do this to me, he whispered. You made me do it. Juliana felt her body tremble. Paolo looked at her, his face contorted with rage. I didn't want to do that. You provoked me. She raised a hand to her aching cheek. You're a freeloader. A good-for-nothing. Juliana closed her eyes. Something inside her broke that night. There was nothing left. Only ashes. Juliana felt the burning in her cheek like a searing fire, but the worst pain wasn't the hit. It wasn't the physical contact or the sting spreading across her skin. What shattered her was the certainty that it had come to this, that the person she had once loved was now the monster she feared. She lifted a trembling hand to her face and felt the swelling beneath her fingers. She couldn't cry. She couldn't show weakness. If she did, Paolo would use it against her, like he always did. He was still there, staring at her with a mix of anger and confusion, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. His lips parted, as if to say something, but Juliana didn't give him the chance. She spun on her heels and ran to the bedroom, locking the door before he could follow. Her breathing was erratic, her body shaking. She slid down against the door, hugging her knees, feeling everything collapse around her. Juliana. Paolo's voice was a roar from the other side of the door. She squeezed her eyes shut. Open the door. The sound of his fist pounding against the wood made her flinch. You can't lock yourself in our own house. The next blow was stronger. I said open it. Juliana pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block out his voice. I know what you're doing. I know you're lying to me. The next hit made the door tremble. You think I don't notice? You think I'm stupid? Paolo was panting, his fury fueled by jealousy, paranoia, by the idea that Juliana belonged to him and that any sign of independence was a challenge to his authority. I saw it on your face when that idiot Andres came over. Juliana's eyes shot open, her heart pounding violently. I saw it. I saw the way you looked at him. Another hit. You're cheating on me. Say it. Juliana felt desperation rise in her throat, a strangled scream that wouldn't come out. Say it, damn it. The sound of the wood cracking made her hold her breath. I'm going to count to 3, and if you don't open this door, I'll break it down. Juliana felt her body curl tighter against the wall. 1. Every muscle in her body tensed. 2. She shut her eyes. 3. The crash filled the room as the door gave way. Paolo burst into the room, breathing heavily, his face twisted with fury. But when his eyes met Juliana's, he froze. She wasn't with anyone. There was no lover. There was no betrayal. Only a terrified woman, curled up on the floor, her hands covering her face, her body trembling, silent tears marking her skin. Paolo blinked as if he suddenly saw himself from the outside, as if, for the first time, he realized what he had become. But he said nothing. He didn't run to embrace her, didn't apologize, didn't try to justify what he had done. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, his hands shaking at his sides, as if he didn't know what to do with them. Juliana didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't beg. She just waited. Waited for him to say something, to do something. But Paolo did nothing. He turned slowly and walked out of the room without a word, leaving the broken door behind him. Juliana was left alone, trembling, feeling like something inside her had died that night. Morning arrived, light filtering through the curtains, illuminating the disaster Paolo had left behind the night before. The bedroom door, shattered, hung from one of its hinges. Splinters of wood lay scattered across the floor. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the mess. It was the silence. Juliana lay in bed, motionless. Her body felt numb, as if her skin no longer belonged to her. She didn't cry. She didn't think. She just existed. Paolo moved around the house as if nothing had happened. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, the coffee maker hummed, the sound of his cup being placed on the table filled the air. Everything carried the normalcy of a routine that should never have existed. When he finally appeared at the bedroom door, his expression was calm, almost indifferent. "I made you coffee." Juliana looked at him, searching for any trace of remorse in his eyes. There was nothing. He didn't mention the broken door, the screams, or the fear he had instilled in her. He acted as if the horror of the previous night had never happened. She didn't respond. She didn't have the strength. With difficulty, she got up and went to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw her reflection. Her cheek was still red, her lips dry, her eyes empty. There was nothing left of the Juliana she had once been. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her from the other side of the glass. In the days that followed, Paolo kept up his act. He returned to his affectionate tone, his gentle gestures. He told her how beautiful she was. He pulled her into his arms when she least expected it. He brought her small gifts as if that could erase everything. But Juliana could no longer deceive herself. She knew what would come next. She knew it was all a cycle, that the calm was only the prelude to the next storm. Andres and Marina insisted on seeing her. Juliana no longer answered messages, but they refused to give up. One afternoon, Marina showed up at her door. When she saw Juliana's state, her eyes filled with anguish. "You have to leave." Juliana lowered her gaze. "I can't." Marina gripped her hands tightly. "Yes, you can. You don't have to live like this." "You don't understand." Her voice broke. "Yes, I do. And I know you're scared, but there's a life out there waiting for you." Juliana felt tears welling in her eyes, but she held them back. Marina didn't understand. No one did. Leaving wasn't that simple. There was something in the air, in the way Paolo looked at her, that made her think that even if she ran, he would find her. Andres also tried to talk to her. He went to the cafe where they used to meet before everything fell apart. Juliana saw him from a distance, waiting, his face filled with worry, making guilt coil in her stomach. Slowly, hesitantly, she walked toward him. "Thanks for coming," Andres murmured when he saw her. Juliana sat down in front of him without saying a word. "I don't want to drag you into this, but you need to listen to me," Andres said in a restrained tone. "He's not going to change. And if you don't leave now, it'll only get worse." Juliana held her coffee cup with both hands, feeling the warmth on her fingers. "What if it's my fault?" Andres tapped the table lightly, as if trying to contain his frustration. "It's not. Don't even think that. No woman should live in fear." Juliana felt something inside her tremble. But the words still weren't enough to push her out of that cage. Until her body said enough. The dizziness came suddenly. At first, it was just constant fatigue. Then came the headaches, the shortness of breath. She felt weak, unable to get out of bed. She couldn't eat without feeling nauseous. For days, she ignored the symptoms, thinking they would go away. But they didn't. One morning, as she tried to reach for a glass of water in the kitchen, her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. Paolo wasn't home. There was no one to help her. She lay there, feeling the cold floor against her skin, trying to gather the strength to stand up. But her body wouldn't respond anymore. And in that moment, she understood. She couldn't stay. Not just because Paolo was dangerous, but because she was destroying herself. She was letting her life slowly fade away. Her body was screaming what her mind had tried to deny for so long. She had to leave. That same afternoon, when Paolo returned, Juliana was sitting at the table, her hands clasped together. He walked in with his usual carefree expression, but stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath. "I'm leaving." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Paolo set his keys on the table with a slow, calculated movement. "Where?" "It doesn't matter." "Yes, it does." Juliana felt her heart pounding, but this time, she didn't let fear paralyze her. "I can't stay here anymore." Paolo smirked coldly. "You have nowhere to go." "I'll find a place." He stared at her for several seconds. Then he leaned in slightly. "You know you're nothing without me, right?" Juliana felt the sting in her chest, but she didn't let his words reach her. "I don't care anymore." She stood up and walked toward the door, her heart in her throat. She expected to feel his hand on her arm, to hear him shout, to be hit. But Paolo did nothing. He just watched her with absolute disbelief. "You're an idiot if you think you can live without me." Juliana opened the door and walked out without looking back. She went straight to the only family she had left. The only person who might still understand her. But she was wrong. When her father saw her enter the hospital room, his expression showed neither surprise nor relief. "You came," he said without emotion. Juliana sat down in the chair next to his bed. "I left home." Hernan looked at her for a few seconds, as if waiting for her to say something else. "And what do you want me to do?" Juliana felt a shiver run through her skin. "I need your help." "For what?" His voice was dry. "I have nowhere to go." Hernan took a deep breath and slowly adjusted himself in bed. "A home is where a woman should be. Go back to your husband." The blow wasn't physical, but it was worse. Juliana felt her throat tighten. Her eyes burned. But her father didn't look away. He felt no pity, no concern, only indifference. She stood up without saying a word. There was nothing to say. She left the hospital with a heavy chest and a painful certainty. She was alone. But this time, she wouldn't stop. With the little strength she had left, with fear still clinging to her skin, with the invisible scars Paolo had left on her soul, Juliana went straight to the police station. She reported her husband for abuse. She described every scream, every blow, every night of fear. She felt her voice tremble, felt panic rise in her chest at the thought of what would come next. But she didn't stop. The police issued a restraining order. Paolo could no longer come near her. When she left the police station, she felt, for the first time, that the air was hers. She moved into a small apartment Marina had offered her. The first night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the bed, staring at the window, feeling the emptiness in her chest. She went to the bathroom and turned on the light. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Maybe one day, she would be herself again. Juliana tried to convince herself that it was over, that her nightmare was finally behind her. The restraining order should have been enough to keep Paolo away, but deep down, she knew he wouldn't let her go so easily. The first few days in her new apartment were strange. The feeling of freedom was overwhelming, but also terrifying. Every noise in the hallway made her jump. Every shadow by the window made her hold her breath. She didn't sleep well. She didn't eat enough. She spent nights curled up on the couch, hugging her legs, trying to convince herself she was safe. But Paolo didn't leave her alone. The messages started coming. At first, they were pleas. "Juliana, please, let's talk." Then, threats disguised as desperation. "You can't hide from me forever." Then, paranoia. "I know where you are." Juliana blocked his number, but he found ways to keep messaging her from other phones. He stalked her on social media, sent emails, left notes on her apartment door. Every time she stepped outside, she felt his presence. She didn't see him, but she felt him. As if he were there, waiting for the perfect moment to appear. And one day, he did. Juliana walked out of the supermarket with a bag in each hand, trying to focus on her breathing. Marina had told her she needed to return to normal little by little, do simple things, regain control of her life. But as she turned the corner of her street, she saw him. Paolo was leaning against his car, arms crossed. He hadn't shaved in days, his clothes were disheveled. His eyes were fixed on her. Fear paralyzed her. "I finally found you," he said with a crooked smile. Juliana gripped the bags tightly. "You can't be here. I just want to talk." "There's a restraining order." Paolo shrugged. "I don't care." She felt her heart pounding violently in her chest. "If you don't leave, I'll call the police." He let out a dry laugh. "You think that's going to stop me?" Juliana felt the air grow heavy. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She could only stare into his eyes, filled with rage and desperation. "You're mine, Juliana. You always will be." She didn't wait to see what he would do next. She let the bags fall and ran. She reached her apartment gasping for air, locked the door, and leaned against the wall, trying to calm the trembling in her body. She knew this wouldn't end until Paolo decided it was over. The following days were a nightmare. Marina and Andres convinced her to go back to the police station and report that Paolo had violated the restraining order. But bureaucracy was slow, and the police only told her to stay alert. Paolo started appearing in unexpected places. He watched her from his car when she left home. He followed her when she went to the pharmacy. He knocked on her door in the middle of the night, left withered flowers on her doorstep. Juliana lived in a constant state of anxiety. She didn't sleep, didn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than when he would show up again. And then it all ended. It was nighttime when Marina called her. Her voice sounded strange, tense. "Juliana, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Paolo is dead." The world seemed to stop. "What?" "He died in an accident. He was driving drunk. He lost control of the car and crashed into a wall." Juliana felt the phone slip from her hands. Paolo was dead. She had imagined this moment so many times, but never like this. Never this way. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt free. But all she felt was guilt. In the days that followed, the news haunted her. She couldn't get the image out of her head, Paolo driving out of control, his thoughts clouded by alcohol, his rage turning into desperation. She had wanted him gone, not dead. She convinced herself it was her fault. If she hadn't run away, if she had tried to fix things, if she had loved him better. "Don't think like that," Marina told her one night when she found her sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. "It's not your fault." "Yes, it is," Juliana whispered. "No, Juliana. It was his choice, not yours." But the guilt wouldn't go away. She had nightmares for weeks. She would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like Paolo was still there, watching her. Sometimes, she thought she saw him on the street, and if she turned quickly, she'd catch him staring from afar. Andres took her to therapy. At first, she refused. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to remember. "You can't keep going like this," Andres told her. "You don't have to carry this alone." Juliana finally agreed. The first sessions were unbearable. She couldn't speak without falling apart. She felt weak, pathetic. But little by little, something began to change. Years passed. The pain didn't vanish overnight. There wasn't a moment when she simply woke up and everything was fine. That's not how it works. But each day, she learned to breathe a little easier. She went back to studying. She went back to going out. She went back to laughing. Looking at herself in the mirror was still difficult. There were days when she saw a stranger. A woman who had been broken so many times that she no longer knew how to rebuild herself. But there were other days when she saw someone who was healing. Someone who, one day, would be herself again. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to leave a comment sharing how you felt while listening to it. And if you have been through a similar experience of betrayal, I would love for you to share your valuable thoughts. I would be truly honored if you left a like, shared this video with a friend or family member, and subscribed to the channel. Don't miss the next surprising story that's appearing on your screen right now. We have guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video.